everyone. My name is Eeswaran from 01 Ventures. We're a European deep tech fund. So we invest in emerging or exponential technologies, including AI. I have quite a personal understanding of it as well. So quite familiar with the topic. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, but this session within AI in society, we're kind of going to be exploring the topic of the role of consumers and the evolving nature of consumers in a in a world which is rapidly adopting and embracing AI. But I'll let the panels start introducing themselves.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Lemm. I'm a journalist. Most recently, I was a senior editor with Wired Germany. Before that, I lived between 1998 and 2014 in San Francisco, sort of had a front row seat to many of the things that we sort of see play out right now. I guess I'm here as kind of the gadfly and the observer. We'll see where that takes us.
I'm Angelo Dalli. I'm an entrepreneur and investor myself, and I have set up many companies, over 45 in my career, had 4 IPOs also, and I've been involved in AI for the last 15 years, back when it was called more like machine learning, big data, and all the different labels that it had. I think AI is something that represents the future for society, so I'm happy to be here in the panel.
Yeah, I'm Sebastian May. I'm working for the Technology Foundation. I'm their lead data scientist. And we're promoting digital innovation here in Berlin. And one of our key focus beyond the industry is particularly looking into how civil society can profit from modern novel innovations like AI and machine learning.
Cool. So to kick off the panel, just as humans need water and air and food to exist, AI requires data to have an existence, without which none of this is actually of any use in the real world. GDPR, not talking about the actual consequence or whether it's a good idea, but what GDPR has done is highlighted that there is a value of personal data or data generated by consumers. So we've had all day talking about insurance. Personalized insurance is advertised as typically a reduction of premiums, but of course for the other 50% it's more expensive. So on the topic of data and consumer rights, I think Karsten, maybe you can kick off where you see things are heading.
Well, to me, what's crucial is the question of who controls the data itself, of course, and the access to data, because what we see in the digital economy in general is that basically success begets more success, and then you get kind of a snowball effect that gives the market leader a 90% share, et cetera, creates monopolies, effective monopolies in certain silos. And so it's crucial, I think, that we as a society don't just kind of wake up one day and say, oops, all of our data is, when it comes to shopping is with Amazon. And by the way, now they're moving into insurance as well. All of a sudden they can tell Karsten has been ordering way too much wine on Amazon lately. Maybe there's a problem. Maybe his insurance rates for healthcare should go up. I think that there's a clear danger for all of us in this, and we should be vigilant at a time now, essentially, before it gets out of control.
I think that identifying the ownership and how your personal data is being used is really, really important. So I think that the recent changes with GDPR are actually a step in the right direction. Obviously, AI has the potential for misuse and good use. For example, one of my companies used to do traffic monitoring systems that scanned license plates, checked where cars are going, seen if there's an accident, for example, in a tunnel. So it was with good intention. But obviously, you could see how this kind of technology can also be used to surreptitiously surveil people also. So there's also a good and bad use. I actually think that in the future, people will have like this anti-ad pop-up blocker software, AI that will game the other AI. Maybe you've heard of this adversarial networks. I think that AI will be trained to actually game the other AI to fool you, for example, where you are, to give you false coordinates and also throw off this kind of systems off track. So I think this is a scenario that's not really discussed that much, but I do think that it's gonna be something that we'll see developed over time.
Yeah, I'm not so much for the government stepping in and controlling us, how we're spending our data, how we're sharing our data, but the past has shown that our users are not caring enough about privacy. Everybody says they care about privacy, but at the end of the day, everybody will sign up for the next social network as long as it gives you some kind of advantage, some kind of nice new feature. So I think there's definitely some need for laws like the new data protection law that we have in Europe now to make the users aware that there's something going on that they have to look into, that they have to be aware of. And we also have to protect people from their data being misused, their data being taken away and taken to new users.
So kind of moving here, we've kind of started touching on concentration of our data with big companies, whether it might be insurers, whether it might be others like Amazon, Google, whatsoever, and now we're starting to government. So recently someone said, generally we have a feeling that government needs to take a proactive role. However, a very early adopter country is a country like Dubai and China. Do we trust those governments when you go and visit to hand over your biometric data and all of that, to have lots of AI being used to monitor you, survey you, do all sorts of things about you without your knowledge? So kind of where around this data concentration, both on corporate and government, I guess, what are your feelings on that, especially thinking about consumers facing this world?
Well, to me, right now, it feels decidedly bipolar or binary, if you want to be nice about it. We have sort of the government-controlled citizen scoring in a country like China, and we have the citizen scoring that we are often not even aware of by companies like Facebook, which then use these scores to serve up better ads or content that we might like. And it's very, very hard to even understand how we are being manipulated by this. And I think there's actually an opportunity for Europe to come up with systems that are sort of more transparent for us as consumers, and make it, first of all, clear that, yes, we are being manipulated by the services that we like most. And secondly, that there are better solutions to this. And then it's for us to decide whether we want to maybe even pay some money for this, rather than just paying with our user behavior and data. It should all be a conscious decision, but I think we need to get to the step that, A, we have an awareness, much more of an awareness, and B, that we then also have alternatives.
However, before the panel continues, thinking about it from a corporate perspective and a government perspective, the low awareness from consumers or people is being exploited at the minute to further the science. A lot of the examples here, the training data came through a lot of indirect use. People didn't actually actively consent for this data to be used in that specific way, which has led to scientific advancement. So I guess, playing devil's advocate, I know there's a moral case that consumers should become more enlightened, but it isn't quite now, could yield quite a lot of benefits as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it will, of course, having better traceability of where your data comes from and where the decisions come from is obviously important. Certain AI systems like deep learning, unfortunately, cannot really explain itself on how it's actually taking decisions. So that is something that I think will need to be changed eventually, because I think that as more and more systems become pervasive, people would want an explanation of how the system came about to a decision. And I think there's the question of bias in the training data. because obviously people do take decisions, they are biased, and it's also a matter of society. For example, we were discussing before, like this personal scoring systems. Again, if I have a system that automatically does the right thing for me, for example, searches, if I'm in insurance, searches for running and healthy lifestyle, even if I'm not really doing it myself, but I have a system that does this, so it ups my score. Probably, yeah, in the States, I'll be like a hero if I do that system. In China, I'll probably end up being labeled as doing something illegal if I were to tamper with the score. So I think these nuances between societies are going to be very, very relevant.
Yeah, I also think we need a lot more transparency and, I don't know, gaining the trust of the user instead of just taking their data. So I think it is completely correct that it's quite complicated to explain complex AI processes in full transparency, because in the end it's a lot of vectors going in and something going out, and in between there's some magic happening. But on the other hand, I don't know, talking to the users and making them aware what the data is being used for, and also maybe the government, again, having some kind of certification processes, especially when we think about biases. We already have a lot of, today we saw a lot of new technologies that will hit the market in a year or maybe in 5 years. But there's so many technologies already in place. It's the Google search engine. It's the police are using AI to run certain identification processes. There's a lot of technologies already embedded in our everyday life who are already changing the way we see the world, the way we interact with the world. And those processes need to be controlled. It need to be controlled by us as a society, and we need to find ways to do this. I don't believe that we can force everybody to maybe open source their data and their algorithms, but we need to find ways to look into the processes, look into especially the training data. We had a lot of examples in the past. For example, we had gender biases where women were not seeing ads for high-paying jobs, for example, or a lot of other examples. So I think especially machine learning and artificial intelligence that is facing the public and is interfacing with our public life need to be somehow kept in check.
Can I just add to this? One of the smartest researchers I know in AI is an Australian researcher named Toby Walsh, and he sort of likes to say he's not afraid of the superhuman killer robot like AI, but rather of the dumb AI. Sorry, let me clarify this. He's not afraid of the super intelligent AI that is somewhere in the distant future. He's afraid of the dumb AI that's already sort of in our daily lives, namely the AI that will, for example, do the pre-sorting of applicants for a job, for an open position, and will sort of, without the humans in the system even realizing, will sort out certain kinds of people. Or if you think about Tesla drivers already trusting way too much, putting too much trust into the autopilot. These are the kinds of things where AI is far from being perfect, but it's already omnipresent in our lives, and we as human beings are already trusting these systems too much without asking, well, how did these results come about? And this is, I think, something we need to address, just like you said, with more transparency, etc.
Yeah, and I think we need to address it right now, because I think the social pressure to implement certain technologies in the future, for example, in medicine. So if an algorithm promises us to cure some kind of disease in a very, very efficient way by some kind of diagnosis technique, but systematically maybe ignores a certain part of society because it was programmed that way, this is a big problem. But on the other hand, it's also would be a great achievement if the overall statistics on this special problem would go down. So we as a society already have to decide now how we're going to think about new technologies like this.
So kind of thinking about those type of topics that you have raised, kind of one rabbit hole we can explore now is, of course, we're seeing not just earlier we touched on the concentration of data, but we're actually seeing the concentration of where AI is commercially available or can be bought, even as a consumer or even enterprise. A lot of enterprises will be buying AI from Google and Amazon on a core level to build from that point. So really, there are kind of a very few US and Chinese companies now who are really kind of having a large market share of both. Kind of, is there a systemic risk to society by this that we're kind of unconsciously walking towards, or what are your thoughts on what we can do about it?
I think there is, actually. Especially Europe, I think, seems to be lagging quite behind in this. So there isn't like a third balancing leg. I mean, if you look at the top 20 AI companies, for example, recently there was this Chinese company called SenseTime that just raised more than $1 billion in total. That is an astounding amount for a relatively new company to raise. And they're all either based in the States or in China. I think the largest company in Europe has around 100 million or so, but it doesn't even make the top 20 list. So I do think that there needs to be also a European perspective in there, because it risks becoming a little bit too unbalanced otherwise. And I do think that there needs to be an ethical framework, like some fundamental rules that people agree upon, to guide the AI developers in all the different countries. Ideally, something that most people accept to be, like universal kind of ground truths. Like, for example, do not weaponize AI, which hopefully most people will agree upon.
Yeah, I think we also need to challenge how we set up our infrastructures, because right now we have very centralized AI technology because there are few companies who provide most of the infrastructure. But there's actually a little bit of work, especially from the hacking community, also going into decentralization. So how can we decentralize those systems? How can we empower the people to run those systems themselves? And also into like local client-side machine learning, for example, where people can create their own artificial intelligences, they can teach them with their own training data and create their own systems in some way. So I think decentralization and empowering people by building their own systems might also be an interesting path to look into.
So on the kind of starting to come back to practical, thinking about it from a corporate perspective, a startup perspective, and in some cases, almost having to anticipate government, like, that there are kind of retrospective consequences of not seeing GDPR coming, for example, that are being unwound at the minute. How should both startups and companies go about thinking ahead of implementing AI projects or building AI services? Like, what would you advocate are some key things they start thinking about?
I think more, to be honest, about the societal kind of side of things. So I'm just going to hand this over. But I think there are a couple of important things when we talk about these systems and where society's interest gets in, and what maybe we should do in terms of framework. But
I think that there should be like basic rules. So, for example, I'm very much against the weaponization of AI. In fact, one of the startups that we created has Professor Noel Sharkey on board, who's the United Nations expert on AI. He's working against, he's making this treaty in which countries sign up to ban autonomous weapons. It's interesting to know that only one EU country has signed it, and China has actually signed up to this so far. And I think, for example, that AI should identify itself clearly, that there should always be a human in the ultimate chain of command kind of thing, and that there is no, there's no willful damage. I think are like three basic principles that should always be followed. And then obviously, I mean, as time goes by, the only guide that we really have are either, human laws, basically, and also science fiction gives us a very good, because they've been thinking about this for a long time. Maybe you're aware of this Isaac Asimov Asimov's rules. I think they've been thinking a lot about this, about how AI will develop in the future. But I think we are very far away from applying those.
Yeah, maybe going back to the data protection law, the new in Europe. I think what they're trying to do is, for example, if somebody signs up to a new service, instead of simply giving them all the rights in an unreadable legal agreement, really telling your users what you're doing, why do you need certain data points from them, what will you provide them as a service for those data points, and then also allowing them, for example, what the new law is asking companies now, that you can at any point just delete your data, remove the data, modify the data, these kind of things, and give your users those rights, and be very upfront what you're doing with the data, how are you providing a certain smart service by gathering the data that you do.
So, but isn't there a little bit of a contradiction with this kind of European approach? Because on one hand, we just discussed that in US and China, there's almost this race to control AI and the data behind it. And in Europe, we want to improve privacy, and we need to have a say, but what we're doing also makes it harder for a European, or more harder compared to those in China and the US. To build this kind of competitive advantage against those companies. So kind of how do you square the two up?
Well, I think you could, if you had actual experts thinking about this rather than politicians who think that they need to act, like in GDPR or the new copyright reform, which is more like a web censorship law. If you had actual experts thinking about this, I'm sure you could find a middle ground somewhere where you anonymize really sort of in a method that is transparent so everybody can see whether your data is really anonymized or not. Anonymize it, then make it available to everybody. One of my favorite examples when you think about where government should have a role is in autonomous driving. Because if currently all the car manufacturers and developers of these systems are essentially allowed to make the same mistakes that everybody else makes because there is no required sharing of data. In aviation, we have seen how the exact opposite yields results, namely every single crash in the world has been looked at and then the results have been shared across the industry. So Airbus could learn from Boeing mistakes, et cetera, and now we have 1 year after another where we have thankfully fewer accidents than ever before, while at the same time we have far more planes in the sky. So that to me clearly shows that we need to take a similar approach to autonomous driving, where if an Uber car has an accident, then a Tesla should learn from it, Mercedes, Audi, etc. Everybody should learn, so that through transfer learning, as it's called, we can much more quickly get these systems to a point where we can actually trust them.
I agree a lot, actually, with this point of view. I think that there should be some kind of accident investigation board, really, that wherever AI can really impact people, by hitting them accidentally and killing them, I think this kind of stuff should be investigated properly, and the results shared within the community, because it will accelerate, and prevent further accidents, and I think it will also not force, but gently nudge everyone towards a consensus and make the inter-systems learning faster.
We had an event a few weeks ago where we were as a French-German collaborative on AI and how we should proceed in Europe. And there we also discussed that we shouldn't always think about this data protection as kind of this restriction on new development and new startups, etc., but also see it as an opportunity to create a new culture, kind of a counterculture to what we see, especially in the Silicon Valley, to use it as an opportunity rather than as a restriction. But obviously, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy to collect data, for example, in Europe, but it could be an opportunity to create some more transparent, better AIs than we see in other places, for example.
So I guess before going to any audience questions, very briefly, just kind of picking up on a practical example that happened recently. In the UK, the NHS collaborated with DeepMind on the health side, sharing very sensitive patient information. For research purposes, it was done upfront with a lot of thought, with a panel of experts. A lot of protections were put in place, and the research was actually quite successful. Now, the friends in the media got wind of this, and started writing about it. And so, as governments do, they ordered yet another investigation into it. And what the report concluded was, although the protections put in place were fine, what they didn't ask was that DeepMind make a guarantee that they're not in the future going to make excessive profits from a monopoly resulting from this R&D. A guarantee of non-profit, or a guarantee, a commitment for modest profit, whatever that means. Government like to kind of put this non-definitive terms in. Should be should be the expectations of governments collaborating with companies on kind of these type of really big positive situations. So that's kind of what we're faced in Europe as a practical example, Sebastian. So kind of how do you see this going? Should we expect more of this, or things to kind of become easier?
We should probably expect more of this. I mean, I'm a completely pro open data, and if the data is probably anonymized, I don't see any problem why they didn't release the data to all companies. Then there wouldn't be that problem, because any company could then easily build their machine learning, their AI based on the data. So there wouldn't be that much. So you had more competition then, and not one monopoly company taking advantage of the data in this case. So, I mean.
Yeah. I think a good model, being in a telecoms building, would be the mobile interconnection agreements, in which you are actually forced to be able to share data with your competitor. So I think that would, as long as the companies who are using that publicly available data, source data, especially taxpayer-funded data also, you'll be able to, restrict yourself to proper use of it, and then you can get access to it. I think that will level the playing field. You can argue, of course, that Google and large companies will have disproportionate resources, but I think that is something that is more difficult to address.
Do we have time for one or two audience questions? Yeah, I think we do. I left a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions for the panel?
Can I just use this?
Is there any question?
I don't see any hands. Otherwise, yes.
One hand here.
There's.
Hi. Thank you. You mentioned data anonymization for sharing data just before right now, which I'm fully in cope with and I agree with. But the problem with such data is often that how do you anonymize the data? Because even if it's not my name on it, you can still, quite in a few ways, if you make it publicly available, specify that this person is there and has that and that information. So how is that not an issue when you talk about such a thing? Or it is probably, but I mean, proper data. Get your point.
Yeah, proper data anonymization is super complex. I mean, I work with spatiotemporal data, especially with spatiotemporal data. It's super easy to identify individuals even if you properly anonymize the data. But there is a lot of techniques. Sometimes you synthesize data, and sometimes you, change the granularity of the data. I mean, there are ways of doing it. Of course, the data gets a little bit, it's not as perfect as it was before, definitely. But there are ways of anonymizing data in a way that you cannot identify individuals afterwards. But it's difficult.
One last.
Straight at the beginning, you mentioned that AI needs data. Is that true? I mean, to me, the first example that comes to my mind is AlphaGo, who started just with rules and goals, how to win a game. And it built up its own database. I mean, this will not solve all our problems in AI, but I don't think AI definitely needs for every solution data.
in some domains like game playing, you can simulate the game. So that's why you didn't need, you could actually play against themselves. So they were like training it by playing the system against itself. But that applies to very restricted domains like games. In the real world, unless you make a perfect simulation like in the Matrix, you will need data to solve real life problems.
And what this shows, of course, is how we are using these days AI as a catch-all term for all kinds of approaches. I mean, a lot of what you hear being referred to as AI is, of course, the neural network / deep learning approach, and that tends to rely on tons and tons of training data examples that the system kind of learns from like a child learns, except it's much less efficient than biology. A child will know after playing with a ball for once or twice, next time, oh, that's a ball, whereas a Google system or any kind of other system needs to look at millions and millions of cat videos to tell the difference between a cat and something else, if it's lucky.
It might find better solutions than humans.
There is an interesting, in fact, deep learning equivalent of the AlphaGo thing that, for example, on videos, what has been recently been done is to actually feed the system like mirror images and like just slightly rotated versions. If you look at the TensorFlow blogs, you'll find it's quite recent, to increase the amount of data there's available. So that's another way of training the system with less data than you can actually gather.
But I think to your point, there is a trend that I'm aware of doing more with less and less data. But principally for the vast majority of cases, some data is required. And if you look at things like medical, you can't simulate real patient data. You have to acquire it. Even though you instead of needing billions, you now need millions, and then it will be thousands. But whether we can go less than thousands is really up for question. I think that would be my view on it. I think we might be out of time. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.